The night everything changed for me started with a broken plate and an Italian curse I wasn't supposed to remember. 1 second. I was weaving through the dining room at Vescari, that upscale Italian place downtown where I'd been serving for 8 months, trying to balance 3 plates on a tray with a fake smile glued to my face. Next, the tray slipped, my fingers missed, and one of those plates hit the polished marble floor with a crack that echoed through the restaurant like a gunshot. White porcelain exploded across the black tiles, veal and sauce splattering in a messy halo. The room went silent in that way. I'd learned to dread all the forks, pausing halfway to mouths, every conversation hanging in the air, dozens of eyes pinning me to the spot. The words slipped out before I could stop them. An old Italian curse my grandmother had used when she burned bread or dropped a pan. I muttered it under my breath, cheeks burning as I dropped to my knees and started scooping jagged pieces of plate into my hands. My manager barked my name across the room, his voice booming with that theatrical anger people like him use when customers are watching. He reminded me loudly that this was the 3rd plate I'd broken that week, said the cost was coming out of my paycheck again, and warned me not to screw anything else up tonight. Andrew Pa, I apologized, because that's what you do when you're broke and tired and clinging to your job by a thread. I swallowed down the frustration and humiliation and went to grab a broom, telling myself it was just another bad moment in a long line of them. At 26, I hadn't pictured my life like this: 2 restaurant jobs, a mountain of student debt from a nursing program I dropped out of when my mom got sick, and an apartment that felt more like a storage unit with a bathroom. Grief had hollowed out most of my insides. The rest I filled with coffee and double shifts. I was sweeping up the last of the shards when the room changed. The soundtrack of clinking glasses and low conversation dimmed, replaced by a ripple of whispers. The maitre d' practically ran to the entrance, his usual calm replaced by nervous energy. I straightened slowly and followed everyone's gaze toward the front doors, my broom still in my hand. That was the first time I saw him in person. He walked in with 3 men in dark suits fanning out around him like shadows, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of easy control that made people step aside without realizing they'd moved. Dark hair, tailored suit, the glint of a heavy watch. But it was his eyes that hooked me: dark, calm, observant. The maitre d' addressed him as Mr. Moretti with the kind of deference he never showed anyone else. I'd heard the name whispered around the city and more quietly in the restaurant's kitchen. The family that owned half the nightlife and protected the rest. The kind of people the police always seemed to miss by an inch. I knew enough to look away, except I didn't. For 1 stupid second, I just stared, standing there in my black dress and cheap flats with a broom in my hand and broken porcelain at my feet. I looked straight at the man everyone else pretended not to see. His gaze slid over the room, landed on the mess in front of me, then lifted to my face. We locked eyes, and it felt like someone had turned a spotlight on me. There was no smirk, no cruel amusement, just this steady, intense assessment, like he was filing me away. I dropped my stare to the floor so fast my neck twinged, finished sweeping as quickly as I could, and escaped into the kitchen, telling myself it didn't matter. He was just another powerful man in an expensive suit. My life was broken plates and bus schedules. Our worlds didn't touch. 10 minutes later, my manager grabbed my arm by the dish pit. "Table 12 needs a server," he snapped. "You're the only one open. Don't screw this up, Sophia. You mess up with that table, you're done here." Table 12. The one against the back wall with the perfect view of the entire room. The one he'd taken without even glancing at the menu. I straightened my uniform, wiped my hands on my apron, and walked out there with my heart doing this slow, hard thud in my chest. I told myself it was just another table, another order, another round of fake smiles. But my legs knew better. They shook just a little as I crossed the room. When I reached them, he was the only one who looked at me. His men scanned the exits, the other guests, the kitchen doors. He studied my face. Up close, he looked younger than I'd expected, early 30s. Maybe, but with that kind of ageless wear you see on people who've already lived 2 or 3 lives. I managed to get through the greeting, the specials, and the drink list without my voice cracking. The others ordered. When I turned to him, he didn't even glance at the menu. He ordered a particular Barolo by year, then asked my name in a way that didn't leave room for a polite deflection. My instinct told me not to give it. My survival instinct reminded me that men like this were not used to hearing the word no, not even over something as small as a first name. So I said it. "Sophia." He hummed like he was committing it to memory, then repeated my full name slowly, as the syllables interested him. He asked about my Italian, about the curse I'd muttered. I felt my face heat as I mumbled something about my grandmother from Florence and her creative vocabulary. His mouth tipped up at one corner, almost a smile. Then he dismissed me with a simple, "Bring the wine yourself, Sophia. Don't send anyone else." The rest of the night blurred around that table. Every time I approached, the conversation died. Every time I leaned in to set a plate down, I could feel the heat of his gaze on my skin. His men barely acknowledged me. One of them brushed his hand against mine in a way that wasn't an accident, his eyes sliding over me with entitled boredom. Before I could yank my hand away, Dominic's voice, because that's when I finally learned his first name, cut across the table, low and sharp. "That's enough." The man backed off instantly, the way people do when they're reminded, a little too clearly, who owns their leash. Dominic didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at him. He just watched me, and there was something in his expression I couldn't read. Irritation, yes, and something else. Possessiveness maybe, or simple calculation. When the bill came, he signed it without looking, left a tip that made me blink twice, and then did something that knocked me completely off balance. He held up a small silver bracelet. For a second, I didn't recognize it. Then my hand flew to my wrist. My mother's bracelet. The one with the tiny key charm that I hadn't taken off since the day the hospice nurse called me to say it was time to come say goodbye. It must have slipped loose during the chaos of the night, fallen under their table. He'd picked it up, held onto it. I reached for it, stammered out a thank you. He didn't hand it over. Instead, he stepped closer, told me to give him my wrist, and fastened it himself with surprising gentleness. His fingers were warm against my skin. For a man rumored to sign off on violence, he handled that fragile clasp like it was made of glass. "Take better care of the things you can't replace," he said quietly. It sounded like a simple piece of advice. It felt like a warning I didn't yet understand. I finished my shift on autopilot, cleaned tables, rolled silverware, smiled at customers whose names I'd never known. When I clocked out close to midnight and stepped into the cool city air, I was ready to collapse. I walked to the bus stop like I did every night, counting my tips in my head, wondering which bill I could afford to pay late this month. That's when the black Bentley rolled up to the curb. The back window slid down, and there he was again, looking at me like the night had never really let me go. "Get in," he said. I told myself it was just a ride. When I slid into the back seat of that Bentley, I kept repeating one sentence in my head like a prayer. "It's just a ride." The door closed with that soft, expensive click that doesn't sound anything like the hollow rattle of a bus door. The leather under me was warm and soft, the kind of thing I'd only ever seen in movies. The air smelled faintly of his cologne, all cedar and spice and something darker underneath. I sat with my bag clutched in my lap, spine straight, every muscle in my body aware of how close he was without actually touching me. He asked for my address like it was a formality, not a question. I gave it to him, embarrassed by the way the street name sounded in my mouth. My neighborhood wasn't on any of the glossy real estate flyers. It was the kind of place where the elevator broke more than it worked, and the corner store sold more lottery tickets than fresh produce. I waited for his expression to shift, for some flicker of judgment or surprise, but his face stayed almost completely neutral. He repeated the address to his driver in that calm, controlled voice, and then the car slid into motion, as if it were moving through a different density of air than everything else on the road. For a few minutes, we just rode. The city's neon smeared itself across the windows in streaks of red and gold. My reflection floated faintly over his in the glass, my tired eyes and messy hair ghosting over his sharp profile. I could still feel the phantom sensation of his fingers closing the clasp of my bracelet around my wrist. That little silver key felt heavier than usual against my skin, like it knew something I didn't. He broke the silence first. He mentioned the Italian curse I'd muttered when the plate shattered, repeating it perfectly. Every rolled R and soft vowel landing exactly the way my grandmother used to say it when she burned Sunday sauce. My cheeks burned. I told him my nonna had taught me a lot of things you wouldn't put in a language textbook. He said it was a colorful phrase for a grandmother to give a child. There was a thread of amusement in his voice, but no mockery, just curiosity. Then he said he liked honesty. It was a simple statement, but coming from a man whose life depended on concealment, it felt heavier. He watched me from the corner of his eye as he said it, like he was checking to see if I'd lie about something small just to make him more comfortable. I didn't. I admitted that I was exhausted, that I'd been dropping things all week, that the restaurant was slowly grinding me down. I told him I'd started nursing school once, and then dropped out when my mom got sick. I didn't tell him about the nights I lay awake calculating interest on my student loans, or the way grief still punched me in the stomach when I saw a woman in a scarf at the hospital. The car rolled off the main streets into the ones I knew better, narrower, darker, a little rough around the edges. My building looked even smaller and sadder from the back of that car. Peeling paint, flickering hallway light, a front door that didn't close properly. I reached for the handle, desperate to get out before the contrast swallowed me whole. But he reached out and rested 2 fingers lightly on my wrist. Wait. He pulled a card from his jacket pocket. Thick cream stock, nothing on it but a phone number in raised black ink. No name, no logo. He slid it into the open mouth of my purse like he was setting a piece on a board. If you ever need anything, he said quietly, call this number. Why? The word slipped out before I could stop it. My voice sounded small in the spacious car. He studied my face for a beat that felt longer than it probably was. Let's call it curiosity, he said. I don't meet many people who curse in my grandmother's language and still look me in the eye after hearing my name. I had no good response to that, so I didn't try. I just murmured a thank you that didn't feel big enough for what he was offering and slipped out of the car. The building's stale stairwell air wrapped around me as the Bentley pulled away, taking that strange pocket of quiet and leather and low music with it. Inside my apartment, the silence was louder. My roommate, Megan, worked nights at the hospital and wasn't home yet. The little one-bedroom we shared by sheer force of will looked exactly the way it always did. Second-hand furniture, chipped mugs, textbooks piled in the corner like ghosts of a plan I'd had to abandon. I dropped my bag on the bed, intending to kick off my shoes and collapse, but my hand brushed the edge of the card and froze. I pulled it out. Plain white. 1 number, no context, no explanation. It shouldn't have felt heavy in my palm, but it did. That card represented something I hadn't had in a long time. An option. I should have torn it in half, flushed it, tossed it in the trash. Instead, I opened the little jewelry box where I kept my mother's ring and hospital bracelet and slid the card in beside them. I told myself it was just to get it out of my bag. It stayed there. The next morning, my alarm dragged me out of a shallow, restless sleep sometime before dawn. My eyes were gritty, my head thick. Megan was just coming in as I was pulling on my uniform for my other job, dark jeans, black t-shirt with Carmela's Cafe embroidered over the chest. She handed me a mug of coffee, the color of jet fuel, and squinted at me over the rim of her own. You look like hell, she said. Late night? I shrugged, took a long swallow of too hot coffee, and mumbled something about double shifts at the restaurant. She watched me for a second too long, then told me, casually, that Mrs. Wilson on the 3rd floor had mentioned seeing me get out of a very expensive car with a very handsome man. The way she said it let me know she didn't entirely buy my double shift answer. I told her a customer had offered me a ride after I missed the bus. I said it like it was nothing, like it happened all the time. Her eyes narrowed. Be careful, Soph, she said. Men with cars like that usually want something, and they're not used to hearing no. Her words followed me out the door and all the way to the bus stop. Carmela's Cafe was a different world from Vescari. Instead of marble floors and hushed voices, there were scuffed tiles, cramped tables, and a line that started before we opened most mornings. The air smelled like espresso and sugar instead of money and steak. The regulars were teachers, construction workers, and college kids. Carmela herself was a 60-something widow with a sharp tongue and a soft heart, and the first thing she did when I walked in that morning was squint at my face and declare that I looked too pale to be trusted with hot coffee. She fed me a slice of frittata before she let me touch the machine. By mid-morning, I had lost myself in the rhythm of it. Shots, steam, ring up, smile, chat, wipe down. It was the kind of busy that kept my brain from wandering too far into rooms I didn't want to revisit. I was wiping down the counter between rushes, watching a couple of students argue over a study guide, when the bell over the door chimed, and the whole energy of the cafe shifted. I didn't have to look up. I knew it was him by the way the conversations dimmed, by the sudden alertness in the room. But I looked anyway. There he was, framed in the doorway, dressed down in a charcoal sweater and dark jeans that somehow made him look more dangerous than the suit from the night before. One of his men lingered just inside the door, scanning like always. His eyes found mine, and he smiled slightly, like we were picking up a conversation from the night before, instead of crashing 2 completely separate lives together. Morning, Sophia, he said when he reached the counter. Hearing my name in his voice made something twist low in my stomach. Carmela came out from the back, and her reaction told me everything I needed to know about how deep his family's roots went in this city. She greeted him by last name, formal and careful, and he addressed her with a respect I'd never seen him show anyone at the restaurant. They traded a few lines about his father and her late husband, history hanging heavy between them. Then he turned back to me and ordered a double espresso and whatever pastry Sophia recommends. I picked an almond croissant because it gave my hands something to do other than shake. He watched me work with that same steady attention, not like a man ogling a waitress, but like a problem solver looking at a variable he hadn't planned on. He said I seemed surprised to see him, and I told him honestly that I was. I pointed out that our worlds didn't exactly overlap on their own. He told me I hadn't exactly been easy to forget. Then he made his real move. He told me his mother was hosting a charity gala that Saturday. He said it was for pediatric cancer research and for families drowning in medical bills they'd never be able to pay. His expression tightened almost imperceptibly when he mentioned the kids. He said he was expected to attend, that he usually brought a certain type of date, the kind of woman who knew which forks to use and how to make everyone in the room feel they were being noticed. He said he didn't want that this time. He wanted me. For a heartbeat, I thought he was joking. I looked down at my apron, at the coffee stain on my t-shirt, at my cheap sneakers. I reminded him that I didn't own anything you could wear to a gala, that I had a shift that night at Vescari, that I didn't belong anywhere near people like his mother and her guests. He told me he'd already spoken to my boss and secured me the night off. He said the clothes could be handled. The rest, he told me, was up to me. Then he slid an embossed cream card onto the counter with an address and a time, and told me a car would come at 7. If I decided not to come downstairs, the car would leave, and that would be the end of it. No hard feelings. It sounded too easy. It wasn't. Even after he left and the cafe slowly stitched itself back together, the invitation burned a hole in my apron pocket. Carmela cornered me near the pastry case as soon as he was gone, her face more serious than I'd ever seen it. She told me families like his didn't take a random interest in girls like me. She warned me that being seen on his arm would paint a target on my back in ways I couldn't even imagine. You step into their world, she said quietly. You don't come back the same. By the time I walked home that night, I'd convinced myself I wasn't going. It was the only logical choice. I couldn't afford to get tangled up in anything complicated, not when my life was already one long balancing act over a very hard floor. I was still rehearsing the little speech I'd give if I ever had to tell him no when I turned the corner to my building and saw the box. It was sitting right against my door. Plain white. Black ribbon. No note. I knew what it was before I even picked it up. Inside was the most beautiful dress I'd ever seen. Deep emerald green with a simple neckline and a skirt that would swing around my knees if I turned. There were black heels that I somehow knew would fit perfectly, and a tiny velvet box with delicate earrings that caught the light when I held them up. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The green will suit your eyes. I stared at the screen, at the dress, at my reflection in the cracked mirror above my dresser. Tired girl, cheap apartment, beautiful gown hanging like a dare. Megan's warning echoed in my head. Carmela's too. So did my mother's voice, from a long time ago, telling me that some doors only open once. I asked him how he knew my size. I pay attention to details, he replied. Does this mean you'll come? I stood there, phone in my hand, the city humming outside my window, and realized that for the first time in a long time, the next step in my life wasn't already decided for me by bills and obligations. I could still have said no. Instead, I typed one word. Yes. It's not unadvised. The second I hit send, I knew I'd crossed a line I wouldn't be able to uncross. Saturday night arrived whether I felt ready for it or not. I spent the day in a haze of nerves, moving through my tiny apartment like I was borrowing someone else's life. I did my own hair because there was no way on earth I could justify paying for a stylist. I did my own makeup with the handful of products I owned, trying to make drugstore minimal look like classic restraint. When I finally put the dress on, it fit like it had been made for me. The green made my hazel eyes look more intense, and the neckline somehow balanced between modest and undeniably feminine. At exactly 19:07 in the evening, the text came. Your car is downstairs. I took a breath that didn't feel like it quite reached my lungs, grabbed my small clutch with my mother's bracelet glinting at my wrist, and walked down the stairs. The same black Bentley waited at the curb, gleaming under the streetlight like it had no business on my block. The driver opened the door with a respectful nod, and just like that, I crossed from my world into his again. The Moretti estate looked like it had been transplanted from another country. Set on a hill overlooking the lake, the house was all stone and angles and wide steps. Light spilled from the tall windows, and the sound of strings and low conversation drifted out into the night air. For a second, standing at the base of those steps in my borrowed dress and good posture, I thought about telling the driver to turn around and take me home. Then I saw him. Dominic stood at the top of the staircase, black tuxedo tailored within an inch of its life, hands in his pockets, watching the cars pull up. When his eyes found me, something in his expression shifted, softened, darkened, sharpened. It was hard to tell. He came down the last few steps to meet me halfway. He told me I was stunning in a voice pitched low enough that only I could hear it. The words sounded practiced, but the way he looked at me didn't. I managed to say thank you without tripping over it, and we went inside together. His world was bright and loud and full of people who had never had to count tips in their heads. Crystal chandeliers dripped light over polished marble. Waiters in crisp white jackets glided through the crowd with trays of champagne. Women in gowns that probably cost more than my yearly rent air-kissed each other and laughed delicately. Men in tuxedos talked in low, serious tones about markets and mergers and offshore this and that. I felt wildly out of place and painfully visible at the same time. Dominic's mother found us quickly. Elena Moretti was in her 60s, elegant in black, her hair swept back to show off the diamond earrings at her ears. Her eyes, dark like her son's, missed nothing. Dominic introduced me as Sophia Parker, his voice steady, hand at the small of my back like he was anchoring me in place. Elena took my hand and squeezed it just a touch too firmly, her smile exact. "Italian?" she asked, in a way that suggested she already knew the answer. "On my mother's side," I said. "From Florence." "Guo." Her smile widened without reaching her eyes. "How lovely." She didn't show her disapproval openly. She didn't have to. Every slight pause, every assessing glance made it clear that I did not fit the usual pattern of women her son brought to events like this. That thought should have humiliated me. Instead, a small, stubborn part of me wanted to stand up straighter. The night blurred into a series of sharp snapshots. The champagne flute was cool in my hand. The feeling of Dominic's fingers flexing against my back every time someone approached us. The weight of dozens of eyes tracking us, people trying to place me, to slot me into a story that made sense. His ex, Francesca, appearing in a red dress cut to draw blood, her eyes sliding over me with open disdain as she reminded him pointedly that his little diversions never lasted. Dominic shut that down with a look that made her step back, but the damage was done. Her words lodged somewhere ugly in my chest. Was that what I was? A distraction? A novelty? A waitress in a borrowed dress, entertaining to bring to a party before he went back to the world of polished, appropriate women who knew how to exist in rooms like this without leaving fingerprints. Later, out on the terrace overlooking the black curve of the lake, I asked him. Not in those exact words, but close enough. He didn't give me a neat answer. He told me that before me, every woman in his life had wanted something from him. Status, money, access, the thrill of proximity to danger. He said I looked at him like he was a puzzle, not a prize. He said that made me dangerous in a way none of them had been. Then, in that same breath, he told me the truth I'd been trying not to stare at directly. His world was violent. His father hadn't retired to Italy for health reasons. He'd been removed. Some people who crossed him simply disappeared. The power he held was built on things that would never show up in charity speeches or glossy magazine spreads. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't apologize for it either. He said he'd done what he thought he had to do to protect the people under his umbrella. I should have turned around and left right then. Instead, I let him lead me into his study. Away from the music and the guests and the performance, the room felt different. Shelves of books that looked well read, a desk that actually had papers on it instead of artfully arranged props. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows was all moonlight on water and city lights in the distance. That was where he kissed me. It didn't feel like a prince meets waitress fairy tale moment. It felt like a collision. Months of exhaustion and grief and hunger I hadn't let myself acknowledge slamming up against years of control and loneliness and power. His mouth was demanding and sure, and I felt myself answering with a ferocity that scared me a little. All the warnings I'd gotten from every direction about men like him, about this world, blurred for a few minutes under the heat of it. The knock on the door that broke us apart felt like someone snapping their fingers in a dark theater. It was his mother. She stepped into the study with the composure of a woman who had spent her entire life walking into rooms where she wasn't supposed to interrupt but had done it anyway. She sent Dominic back to the party with a few carefully chosen words about donors and expectations, then shut the door and turned her full attention on me. She didn't yell. She didn't insult me. She sat down, crossed her elegant legs, and laid out my life like she'd read it in a file. Nursing school. Dropped out for my mother's treatments. Crushing debt. 2 jobs. An apartment. 1 bad month away from disaster. She said she admired my loyalty, my sacrifice. Then she opened her clutch and slid an envelope across his desk toward me. $50,000. Enough to clear my debts. Enough to go back to school. Enough to move, start over, push my life back onto the track it had been on before everything went sideways. All she asked was that I walk away. Tonight. No goodbye, no drama. Just a clean break, before whatever this was with her son got deeper and harder to escape. She said she was trying to protect me. And, she admitted, protect him. Men like her son, like his father, didn't do halfway. If he decided I belonged to him, the world would know it. So would his enemies. I would spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, adjusting my habits, paying for crimes I hadn't committed just by association. She told me she'd once been me. Young, enchanted, convinced that love could live peacefully alongside the terrible things power requires. She said she loved her life and her son, but that she would not choose it again for herself or any girl with other options. I stared at that envelope until the numbers blurred. $50,000. In my world, that was a miracle. A second chance. A lifeline. I thought about my mom, about the way she'd made me promise not to let her illness steal more of my life than it had to. I thought about hospital bills stacked on the kitchen table, about crying quietly in bathroom stalls between shifts, about the way my hands shook when I opened loan statements. It should have been an easy choice. Take the money, walk away, go back to the plan. When Dominic came back to the study and saw the envelope, his face went blank in a way that scared me more than his anger would have. He asked what she'd offered. I told him I hadn't given her an answer yet. He didn't beg me to stay. He didn't try to guilt me. He just stepped close, touched my cheek with the back of his fingers, and told me that if I decided I wanted the life on the other side of that envelope, he would not stand in my way. His voice shook, just a little, when he said it. Because whatever this is between us, he said quietly, it doesn't erase what my name will put on your back. 18. When he left me alone again, I sat in that beautiful, heavy room with its lake view and its crystal decanter for a long time. The envelope on the table between my hands, trying to figure out whether taking the safer road now would hurt less than wondering for the rest of my life what stepping into the dangerous one might have changed. In the end, I didn't take the money. I left the envelope on the table, picked up my mother's bracelet, and walked back into the party. I knew one thing as the music swelled around me and his eyes found mine across the room. Nothing about my life would ever be safe again. But for the first time in a very long time, it felt like it might finally be mine. The strange thing about falling in love with a man like Dominic is how quickly extraordinary becomes normal. 6 months after that gala, my mornings started with alarms and textbooks. My afternoons smelled like disinfectant and grape popsicles. My nights tasted like expensive wine and the kind of food I used to carry instead of eat. I was back in nursing school full-time, thanks to a tuition bill that had mysteriously vanished after Dominic made some calls, and I was working part-time at the pediatric wing of Street Claire's as a nurse's aide while I finished my degree. I also lived in a glass and steel condo overlooking the lake, in a building with a doorman who learned my coffee order within a week. The first time I walked into that penthouse with a suitcase full of thrift store clothes, I felt like I was trespassing in someone else's life. The countertops were marble instead of laminate. The appliances worked on the first try. The shower pressure didn't cut out when someone in the next apartment flushed. A cleaning service came twice a week. There was more closet space than I knew what to do with. I kept my little jewelry box on the nightstand anyway. My mother's ring, her bracelet with the silver key, the blank white card with the phone number I'd already used more times than I could count. Tiny anchors in a life that was changing too fast. To his credit, Dominic never tried to turn me into something I wasn't. He bought me clothes sometimes, yes, but they were practical as often as they were pretty. Good scrubs that didn't fade after 2 washes. Comfortable shoes that made 12-hour shifts bearable. When he handed me the receipts for my tuition payments, he told me it wasn't charity, it was maintenance on a very important asset. I rolled my eyes and kissed him anyway. We slid into a rhythm that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. He'd come home late some nights, tie loosened, eyes shadowed in a way that told me his day had involved decisions he couldn't talk about. Other nights, he was there before me, stirring sauce at the stove, or attempting to follow a recipe on his phone with a frown of concentration. He asked about my patients. He learned which kids I couldn't stop thinking about after shifts and listened when I talked about them in too much detail. We didn't talk much about his work, not because I refused to see it, but because we both understood there were parts of his world that would only burden me without giving me any power to change them. I picked up pieces in the edges of conversations, in the tired set of his shoulders, in the men who stood a little too still in corners at events, and always seemed to know where I was. Our lives intersected publicly for the first time at the hospital's annual gala. I went as both a nurse and as the partner of a major donor. The first time I'd walked into one of these events on his arm, I'd felt like a prop. This time, I also belonged there. The kids smiling from the photos on the wall were versions of people I'd wheeled down hallways and sat with at 3 in the morning while machines beeped steadily. He noticed that. He watched me talk to doctors and techs and fellow nurses, slipping back into my world as easily as I put on scrubs. He told me quietly that seeing me there, in both halves of my life, made something in him shift. So maybe it shouldn't have surprised me when the universe sent someone to test how real that shift was. I met the detective in a hallway, near the bathrooms, where the music from the ballroom smoothed into a dull thump through the walls. He was standing in front of a poster about the hospital's outreach program, hands in his pockets, suit slightly rumpled. The kind of man who looked like he hadn't taken a real vacation in years. When he turned and saw me, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. I realized I'd seen him before. At the cafe months ago, sitting in the corner with a newspaper he never really turned the pages of. Outside Vescari once, sipping coffee across the street. I'd written him off as a regular, a stranger passing through. Now, with the badge clipped to his belt and the set of his jaw, the pieces rearranged. Organized crime unit. He didn't come at me like in the movies. No slammed hands on tables, no threats. He asked if I was enjoying the gala, made a bland comment about the hospital's work, and then, very gently, asked if I understood who I was standing beside these days. He never said Dominic's name. He didn't have to. He laid out my life as clearly as Elena had in the study, but from a different angle. The debt is erased, the fancy address, the tuition payments, the security details I pretended were just friends of Dominic's hanging around a lot. He told me he'd seen women get caught in this orbit before. Some went in with their eyes closed and paid for their denial in bruises and hospital stays. Some went in eyes open and still got broken in quieter ways. Isolated, hardened, turned into versions of themselves they didn't recognize. He said I still looked like myself. He said he didn't want to watch that change. Then he did something I hadn't expected at all. He offered me a way out. Not in the form of a bribe or a threat, but in paperwork and programs and phrases like, if it comes to that, witness protection, relocation, new identity, a clean slate in a place where Dominic's name wouldn't follow me like a shadow. All I had to do was decide that love wasn't worth this level of risk. I walked back into the ballroom with my heart pounding against my ribs in a slow, heavy rhythm. Dominic saw the shift in my face instantly. He excused himself from a conversation with a surgeon and came straight to me, his hand at my back, eyes searching. We stood in the corner of that glittering room, surrounded by people laughing over dessert and auction paddles, while I told him about the detective, about the warning, about the offer. His jaw flexed. His hand tightened on my hip. For a second, I felt the old version of him rise up, the one who solved problems by removing them entirely. Then he swallowed it down. He told me he could make this pressure go away in his own way. I told him that wasn't the point. The point was that the world wasn't going to politely ignore the fact that my life now bled into his. People were watching. Some with badges, some with grudges. Some have both. We could pretend we were invisible, or we could build something sturdy enough to survive being seen. He asked me, point blank, if I still wanted this. Him. This life. The risk and the mess and the love that had woven itself through all of it, almost without my permission. I thought about the envelope in his study, and the boxes I'd left unpacked in my first months in the condo because I wasn't sure I'd last. I thought about my mom, about the promise I'd made her to keep living, not just existing. I thought about the way his hand shook just a little when he thought I wasn't looking. I told him yes. I told him I was in this with my eyes open. He nodded slowly, something fierce and fragile in his eyes at the same time. Then we adjust, he said. He meant the security, the schedules, the distance between his business and my work. Neither of us knew yet that the world was about to force us into much bigger adjustments than blocked numbers and changed routes. The night in the hospital parking garage stripped away any illusion that this was just a game between Dominic and the law. It was a Tuesday. I'd stayed late to sit with a 6-year-old who was terrified of the MRI machine, counting the loud thumps with him and making up silly names for the noises until he stopped shaking. By the time I changed out of my scrubs and walked out into the garage, my body was running on caffeine and autopilot. The garage was mostly empty. My little hatchback sat in its usual corner spot. The overhead lights buzzed in that way that makes everything feel one flicker away from darkness. My footsteps echoed as I crossed the concrete, keys threaded between my fingers the way my mom had taught me when I was 16 and walking home from shifts at the grocery store. I didn't see the man at first. I felt him. That prickle on the back of my neck. The subtle shift in the air when you're not alone anymore. I slowed without thinking. scanning between the parked cars. He stepped out from between two SUVs like he'd been placed there, jeans, hoodie, hands in his pockets. He smiled when he said my name. It wasn't a nice smile. He talked about Dominic without saying his name, about men who forget their place and distractions that make them careless. He told me it would be a shame if someone got hurt because a certain boss was too busy playing house with a nurse to watch his territory. His tone was light, almost teasing. I heard the threat underneath every syllable. He didn't touch me. He didn't need to. The message was clear. You are leverage. We can hurt him through you. Before I could decide whether to run or scream or try to bluff, another voice cut through the space. Deeper, firmer, infinitely calmer. One of Dominic's men stepped out of the shadows near the elevator, followed by another near the ramp, followed by a third, whom I hadn't even noticed, leaning against a pillar by the exit. They moved like a net closing. The man in the hoodie's smile vanished. Whatever easy confidence he'd been faking dissolved as he realized he'd misjudged the situation. He backed away, muttering something about jokes, about misunderstandings, about being in the wrong place. Dominic's men didn't follow. They just watched him leave, the way a storm watches a wave retreat. One of them walked me to my car. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He didn't lecture me or tell me what could have happened. He just stood there while I unlocked the door, waited until I was inside with the engine running, then nodded once and stepped back. I drove home with my hands shaking so hard I had to pull over once and breathe through it. Telling Dominic about it was like lighting a fuse in a room full of dynamite. He went very still while I told the story, eyes darkening, mouth flattening into a line. When I finished, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He just stood up, kissed my forehead, and told me he'd handle it. The way he said those words made the hair on my arms stand up. I don't know what he did. I don't know whose name was spoken over phones that night or which lines in the city's invisible map were redrawn. I just know that the man in the garage never appeared again, and the streets around the hospital felt different, tighter, safer in some ways, more clearly under someone's watch in others. A week later, the detective showed up at the hospital again. This time, he didn't pretend it was a coincidence. He asked to speak to me in a family room, his badge visible, his expression carved into that careful shape cops use when they're delivering news you're not going to like. He said he'd heard about an incident in the garage. He asked if I was okay. Then he asked very gently, but very directly, if I understood now that the danger was real. He repeated his offer. Witness protection, new name, new city. A life where my biggest worry would be night shift rotations and maybe a noisy neighbor. Not whether some rival crew might decide to use me as a warning. For a heartbeat, I let myself imagine it. A little apartment in a town where I didn't know all the shortcuts. A hospital badge with a different name. Coworkers who hadn't watched my life unravel in real time. Silence where there had once been sirens. Then I thought about Dominic, about the way his hand had trembled when he fastened my bracelet the first night, and the way his voice had caught in the study when he told me he'd let me go if I wanted to walk. I thought about the kids at the center he'd started funding quietly in our neighborhood, places where teenagers came to play basketball and use computers instead of standing on corners. I thought about the way he'd listened when I told him I couldn't give up the hospital. I told the detective no. Again. This time, I told him something else too. I told him I refused to turn Dominic into a cartoon villain in my own mind, just because it made other people's jobs easier. That I knew exactly what kind of man he was in the world. That I also knew he was more than the sum of his worst acts. That I was willing to live with the tension between those truths. The detective looked at me for a long moment. Then he told me that loving someone didn't obligate me to stay if their darkness started swallowing me. That sometimes the bravest thing you could do was walk away before you forgot who you were without them. He said he hoped, sincerely, that I would never have to choose between my safety and my heart. The thing was, I already had. I chose my heart, and then I chose to fight like hell for my safety inside that decision. I walked out of that family room knowing the storm wasn't done with us yet. I just didn't know how hard it was going to hit. When the indictment came down, it didn't arrive as a surprise. It arrived like a clock striking an hour that everyone in the city had been counting down to for years. The news broke on a Thursday. I was in the break room at the hospital, half watching a cooking show on the mounted TV while I scarfed down a sandwich between patients. The channel cut to a breaking news banner, and suddenly there it was, Dominic's last name on the screen, scrolling under footage of unmarked sedans in front of a courthouse. Racketeering, conspiracy, financial crimes, acts of violence and furtherance of an enterprise. They said it all in that smooth, practiced anchor voice, like they were reading movie credits. In the days that followed, the city turned his life into content. Old photos of him at charity galas, Grainy videos of his club's entrances, B-roll of docks and warehouses and nighttime streets. Experts on crime panels talked about dismantling empires and sending a message. The detective appeared in a suit that fit a little better than the one he'd worn in the hospital hallway, saying careful things about justice and communities and the importance of ending cycles. At home, it was quieter. The penthouse felt too big. The silence pressed against my ears when the TV was off. Elena came over more often, her lipstick perfect, her worry showing only in the tightness of the muscles around her mouth. Men I didn't know came and went at odd hours, murmuring in the office with the door closed. Dominic's lawyers were sharks in suits. They spread files across the dining table and talked about evidentiary chains and motions to suppress. They poked at the timeline, searching for weak links. They never promised it would all go away. They promised to make the state work for every inch. The worst blow wasn't the charges. It was the star witness. Everyone in our world assumed it would be some lieutenant. Someone who'd gotten picked up one too many times and decided to trade loyalty for a shorter sentence. No one expected it to be family, until the news leaked that Dominic's younger brother, Marco, had made a deal. I found out the same way everyone else did. Scrolling past a headline that said "Insider Flips on Moretti Organization," and seeing a familiar face in the accompanying photo. Marco, in a suit, eyes hard and mouth pressed tight, standing next to a lawyer whose specialty was cooperation agreements. The look on Dominic's face when he saw it was something I'll never forget. Not anger. Not shocked. Just this hollowed-out sadness that made him look older than I'd ever seen him. The trial felt like a play we were all being forced to act in. The courtroom was cold. The benches were hard. The judge looked like he'd seen some version of this same story more times than he could count. The jury watched everything with that quiet, uncomfortable fascination people get when they're handed someone else's fate and told to weigh it. The prosecution painted Dominic as a mastermind. They talked about enterprises and patterns of racketeering activity. They showed charts tracing money through shell companies and offshore accounts. They played snippets of calls, the parts a judge had deemed admissible, where Dominic's calm voice floated over static, never quite saying anything explicitly illegal, always hovering near it. When Marco took the stand, he called Dominic "my brother," and then carved into him with clinical precision. He said Dominic had shut him out of decision-making, had ordered things he'd protested, had prioritized fear and control over modernizing their business. He cast himself as the reluctant participant, the one who wanted to go legitimate, but was held back by Dominic's refusal to let go of old ways. Listening to him felt like watching a house I'd lived in catch fire in slow motion. On cross-examination, Dominic's lawyer poked holes in the story, pointed out the deals hanging over Marco's head. The sentences reduced in exchange for his testimony, the ways he'd benefited from the very lifestyle he now condemned. It helped. Some. But you can't unring a bell, especially not one rung in front of a jury and 3 cameras. When it was my turn to testify, my knees threatened to fold on the walk to the stand. They asked the usual questions. Yes, Dominic paid my tuition. Yes, I lived in his apartment. Yes, he'd given me gifts that cost more than anything I'd ever bought for myself. Yes, I understood what his family was known for. Before I got involved with him, the prosecutor tried to steer me into a narrative. Naive girl, dark prince, manipulation disguised as romance. I refused. I told them I wasn't stupid. I told them I had known enough, early enough, to make a real choice about whether to stay. I told them I'd seen parts of him that didn't fit in their case file. The man who funded the hospital's outreach quietly, who paid 3 months' rent for a family on my unit after their eviction notice came, who shut down men in his own organization when they crossed lines he didn't tolerate. I didn't pretend that made him innocent. I just refused to pretend it didn't exist. His lawyer used my testimony to try to introduce nuance. The judge let a little of it in, and barred the rest with repeated reminders that character doesn't erase crime. He was right. And also, in the messy real world, he was missing something. A week into the trial, there was a flurry of closed-door meetings. The lawyers went back and forth between the judge's chambers and a side conference room. Dominic came back from one of those huddles with his jaw tight and his shoulders squared in a way that made my stomach twist. The next day, his lawyer announced a plea. Not everything, never to everything, but too much. Racketeering conspiracy. Certain financial counts. Admissions calibrated to cover what they knew the state could prove, while walling off other areas from further digging. In return, a recommended sentence of 5 years. Fines. Restitution. No additional charges for family members or associates named in sealed documents. I didn't need anyone to translate that last part. It meant me. The judge took the deal. The spectators murmured. The prosecution looked half triumphant, half cheated of the drama of a verdict. The detective sat in the second row, his face unreadable, hands folded like he wasn't sure if this was victory or compromise. Dominic turned in his chair and looked at me. In that look, I saw every other version of his life. He could have chosen a longer fight, a riskier trial, a gamble with decades instead of years. He had chosen certainty. He chose to carry 5 years himself rather than roll the dice and risk me and others being dragged into the system as collateral. When the judge asked if he understood the terms, Dominic's voice was steady. Yes, Your Honor. When the judge asked if anyone had forced him to plead, he said no. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. I knew exactly who he thought he was protecting. You'd think the day he surrendered himself would be the worst. It wasn't. The worst was the night before, when the apartment was quiet and everything we did had a countdown attached to it. Every cup of coffee, every shared look, every time his hand brushed my hair back from my face. There's a special kind of grief in losing someone who is still right there in front of you. The morning he went in, the sky was a flat, indifferent gray. We drove to the facility mostly in silence. He held my hand across the center console the whole way. Outside the gate, he turned to me and said something I'd been bracing for but didn't want to hear, that he didn't expect me to put my life on hold for him. Those 5 years were a long time, and he would understand if, at some point, I needed something he couldn't give from inside concrete and steel. I told him that was my decision to make, not his. I didn't promise forever. Forever is a big word to throw around in a parking lot outside a prison. I promised effort. I promised honesty. I promised that I wouldn't run just because things got hard. I'd had chances to run when there were checks and new identities and clean breaks on the table. I hadn't taken them. I wasn't going to bolt just because the circumstances had turned less cinematic and more bureaucratic. He kissed me, hard and soft all at once, and then walked through the gate. Watching the man you love disappear into a building like that is like watching part of your own body get cut off in slow motion. The thing no one tells you, though, is that life doesn't pause for your heartbreak. I still had exams. I still had patience. I still had bills. I finished my degree. I walked across a stage in a gym that smelled like sweat and popcorn, wearing a gown that didn't quite fit and a cap bobby pinned to my hair. Elena sat in the stands and cried into a handkerchief. There was an envelope waiting in my mailbox when I got home with a card in Dominic's cramped handwriting, telling me how proud he was, and a photocopy of a certificate showing he'd completed a business course inside. To keep up, we built a rhythm out of what we had left. Phone calls twice a week. Sometimes the connection was bad, and we had to shout over static. Sometimes it was clear enough that I could hear other men's voices in the background, TVs blaring. We talked about my patients, with names changed, his classes, and the books he was reading. We talked about nothing TV shows, recipes he wanted to try when he got out. Sundays were for visits. The first time I saw him in a prison visitor's room, the fluorescent lights made his skin look sallow. The jumpsuit hung wrong on his frame. There was a new tension around his mouth, a new way he scanned the room without seeming to move his eyes much. But when I sat down, and he smiled, it was the same smile that had made my stomach flip the night he fastened my bracelet. We learned how to touch within boundaries, hands on the table, fingers brushing. One quick hug, hello, one goodbye. The rest of the time, we held on with our eyes and our words. I became a full-time nurse on the pediatric unit. I learned how to manage my time better and my tears worse. I saw kids beat odds and others lose fights they should have won. I watched parents break in slow motion and do their best to knit themselves back together for the sake of the child still watching them. I went home some nights so tired I could barely make it from the elevator to the couch. The card he'd given me that first night sat in my jewelry box, worn at the edges now from all the times I'd taken it out and put it back. The detective drifted out of my day-to-day life. Once in a while, I'd see his name in an article about another case. Once, I spotted him across the street from the hospital, watching the entrance with that same intent expression. Our eyes met, and he nodded once, like an acknowledgement of a battle that was still ongoing, even if the front line had moved. Inside, Dominic changed, not in some dramatic jailhouse conversion way. He didn't suddenly find religion or renounce his past, but he started paying attention to different things. He took classes. He mentored younger inmates who reminded him uncomfortably of boys he'd once put to work on the outside. He wrote notes in the margins of books about conflict resolution and leadership, laughing when he read me some of the more naive examples. We talked about the future in cautious, careful ways, about what he could do that didn't involve skirting laws, about what my career might look like once I've put in a few years on the unit. about the kind of life we might be able to build that didn't require either of us to pretend we hadn't come from where we came from. Time, which had felt glacial in the first months, started to move. Seasons changed outside his walls. Kids in my unit grew up, went home, or didn't. My hair got a little shorter. He's got a little grayer at the temples. The city built new condos and knocked down old warehouses. The world kept spinning. The day he walked out for good, I realized 5 years had been both an eternity and the blink of an eye. He didn't come home to marble floors and crystal glasses. We didn't go back to the penthouse. That place belonged to another version of our life, a chapter that had needed to end so a different one could start. We moved into a smaller place in a neighborhood he used to own in a different way. Still nicer than where I'd started, but closer to the streets where the kids on my unit actually lived. He didn't go back to the old business either. Some of it was gone, carved up by rivals or swallowed by legitimate companies. Some of it he let go of on purpose, not because he'd suddenly become a saint, but because he'd had 5 years to sit with the cost of everything. He knew exactly how much blood had been squeezed out of which corners of the city. He knew he didn't want to spend whatever time he had left trying to resurrect that, so he took the skills he had and redirected them. The first thing he did was open a security company. On paper, it was a standard firm risk assessments, bodyguards, event security. In practice, it was also a second chance machine. He hired guys with records who no one else would touch, put them through real training, and got them licensed. He taught them how to use the instincts they'd honed in the wrong context, in ways that didn't end with sirens. The second thing he did was open the center. It sat in a building that had once housed a betting shop. Now there were basketball hoops, computers, a tiny kitchen, and a wall covered in flyers about tutoring and job fairs. On the paperwork, the owner was a nonprofit with a bland name. In the neighborhood, everyone knew whose idea it really was. Kids showed up after school because there was Wi-Fi and snacks, and adults who didn't flinch when they raised their voices. Over time, they started showing up because it felt safe, because someone noticed if they didn't. I started volunteering there on my days off, helping with homework, answering questions about anatomy, nursing school, and how to fill out financial aid forms. Watching teenagers who had been written off by teachers light up when they realized they were good at something. Whether that was math, drawing, or getting a dozen small children to follow instructions during a game. Dominic was mostly a background presence. He didn't stand in front of the room and give speeches. He talked to parents in corners, to old heads on the block, to the kind of men who'd once have seen this cluster of kids as a recruiting pool. He made it clear, in the quiet way only someone like him can, that whatever wars were still being fought in this city, the center was neutral ground. The detective came by once, not with a warrant, not with backup, just as a man in a button-down shirt, hands in his pockets, watching from across the street for a while before finally walking over. He looked older, more lines around his eyes, a little more gray at his temples, the kind of aging that comes from years of carrying other people's worst secrets. He stood in the doorway and looked at the kids playing pickup ball in the back, the girls huddled over a laptop, the flyer for free flu shots I'd taped to the wall. "Is he here?" he asked me, his voice low. "Yeah," I said. "In the office." He nodded, like that confirmed something he'd already suspected. He didn't ask to see Dominic. He just said, almost to himself, "Funny thing about leverage. Sometimes it breaks a system. Sometimes it pulls it into a different shape." We stood there for a minute, watching a kid sink a basket and explode into the kind of joy I never saw in hospital rooms. "This isn't the ending I expected," he said finally. "Or the one I would have written. But I'm not blind. Some of these kids are going to have better odds because of this place. That counts." Then he left. No threats, no promises. Just a quiet acknowledgement that not every story turns out the way the case file says it should. Life settled into something that felt, astonishingly, like normalcy. My shifts on the pediatric unit were still long and hard and holy in the way only people who've worked around sick children really understand. Some nights, I came home crushed by loss. Others, I came home high on a discharge we hadn't dared hope for. Dominic learned how to hold that with me without trying to fix it. He had his own bad days. Business deals that went sideways. Old ghosts that showed up in new ways. Nights when he woke up, breathing too fast. The walls closing in on him even though he was free. I learned how to be patient with the aftershocks prison left in his nervous system. We got married one Tuesday afternoon at the courthouse. No string quartet, no 5-course meal. Just a judge with kind eyes, 2 witnesses, and my mother's bracelet shining on my wrist. Elena cried softly and kissed both our cheeks. Afterward, We got tacos from a truck and ate them on a bench, laughing at how anticlimactic the legal part of us becoming official felt compared to everything we'd been through already. Sometimes people ask me if I regret anything. If I had wished, I'd have taken the envelope from his study. If I wished, I'd have said yes to the detective's offer. If I wished, I'd choose easier men and simpler lives. The honest answer is no. Not because this path wasn't hard. It was brutal sometimes. It asked more of me than I thought I had in some moments. It forced me to confront my own ideas about right and wrong, about love and loyalty, and the price of both. But it also gave me things a safer path never would have. It taught me that people can change not into entirely new creatures, but into truer versions of themselves. It taught me that love isn't about fixing someone or ignoring their flaws, but about seeing them clearly and choosing them anyway, with boundaries and honesty, and a willingness to walk if the line ever gets crossed. It taught me that I am stronger than the girl who dropped that plate on the marble floor ever imagined. If you're listening to this, if you've made it all the way through my messy, complicated story, you might be standing at your own crossroads. Maybe it's not about organized crime and indictments. Maybe it's about a job that's killing you slowly, or a relationship that looks good on the outside but leaves you empty, or a dream you've buried under practical for years. I can't tell you what to do. I can't promise that choosing the harder road will always lead somewhere beautiful. I can't promise that staying will always be noble or that leaving will always be selfish. All I can tell you is what I learned standing between two worlds. Your life is yours to write, even when other people try to pick up the pen. Even when systems and expectations and fear box you in. You get to decide which risks are worth taking and which are just pain in disguise. You get to decide which loves are worth holding on to and which are asking you to disappear. I chose a man the world told me to run from. I chose him knowing exactly how much damage he'd done and how much he was capable of doing. And I chose to stay only as long as he kept choosing growth over comfort, accountability over denial. So far, we're still choosing each other. Not in some storybook happily ever after way, in an everyday, real world, even on the hard days I'm glad it's you kind of way. And for me, for the girl who once thought her life had shrunk down to broken plates and overdue bills, that is more than enough. If any part of this made you feel seen, I'd honestly love to hear your story too. Because the thing that got me through all of this wasn't perfect choices or perfect love. It was knowing that somewhere out there, other people were also stumbling their way through dark and light, doing the best they could with the hearts they'd been given, just like me.